You know that feeling, like when you're watching a psychological thriller and the main character is just slowly walking toward a door in a pitch black basement?
Oh, yeah. The music swells, the shadows get longer, and you just know it's a bad idea.
Right. And you were just sitting there on the edge of your seat, shouting at the screen, like, don't open the door, turn around, just walk away.
Yeah, it's that creeping, that inevitable sense of dread. Like, you know something terrible is waiting on the other side of that door, but you are completely powerless to stop the character from turning the handle. You're just trapped in the momentum of the story.
Exactly. It is this really visceral, collective anxiety. You're forced to be a witness to a disaster. Honestly, that exact feeling, that terrifying anticipation of an unavoidable collision between a human being and their fate is where we find ourselves today. We're taking a deep dive into, well, one of the most profound poetic dramas of the 20th century. T.S. Eliot's 1935 masterpiece, Murder in the Cathedral.
It really is a masterpiece. I mean, it's a play that fundamentally changed modern theater. On the surface, it's a historical true crime story, basically.
Yeah.
It's a verse drama detailing the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was brutally assassinated in his own church in the year 1170 by 4 knights who were claiming loyalty to King Henry II. But beneath that historical surface, it's a labyrinth. It's full of spiritual conflict, political theory, and just massive existential dread.
And here is the promise for this deep dive. Because whether you are, rigorously studying this era of literature for a major exam, or maybe you're prepping to lead a discussion on modern drama, or honestly, if you are simply someone who loves unpacking really dense, brilliant works of art, you are going to walk away from this conversation with a profound understanding of this play.
Absolutely. No important points will be missed.
Right. We are going to explore exactly what Beckett is going through, the critical theories that frame the narrative, and the fascinating, really contradictory history of the man who wrote it.
Because you really cannot understand Thomas Beckett's journey in this play without first understanding T.S. Eliot's own journey.
Right, that's so true.
The spiritual and artistic evolution of the author is like the hidden engine driving every single line of dialogue in this cathedral.
I want to start exactly there, because Eliot wasn't just writing a history play.
Yeah.
He was working out his own profound philosophical and religious crises right there on the stage. So let's look at who T.S. Eliot was before he became the monumental, untouchable figure of modern poetry.
Right, the guy we all had to read in college.
Exactly. So he was born in 1888 in St. Louis, Missouri, and his family background is just the absolute bedrock of his psychology. His grandfather, William Greenleaf Eliot, was this pioneering Unitarian minister. She actually moved to St. Louis to establish a church, and he helped found Washington University.
And we really need to pause here and define what that environment actually felt like, because Unitarianism is key to understanding Eliot's early worldview. In mid-19th century America, Unitarianism had emerged as a direct counter-movement against strict traditional Puritanism.
Right, because Puritanism is heavy. I mean, it's focused on the doctrine of damnation, original sin, human depravity.
Total depravity, yeah.
It's a worldview where you are constantly being judged by a really wrathful God.
Precisely. But Unitarianism flipped that script entirely. They believed in humanity's innate goodness. They perceived God not as a wrathful judge, but as fundamentally kind. It was highly rational, very optimistic, and deeply, deeply civic-minded as a faith.
And his grandfather was a towering figure in this world, right? Preaching self-denial and endless public service. Eliot's mother was actually so deeply influenced by her father-in-law that she wrote his biography and dedicated it to her children.
Oh, wow. No pressure.
Right. And she explicitly stated in the dedication that it was, quote, left they forget. Imagine growing up with that kind of pressure. Young Thomas is raised in this incredibly earnest, service-oriented environment where God is kind, sure, but the expectation to be a pillar of the community is just suffocatingly high.
Yeah, that kind of moral inheritance is incredibly heavy. And as Eliot grows up, a fracture occurs. He starts school a bit late, due to a congenital hernia, which perhaps isolates him a bit, makes him more observational. But eventually, he makes his way to Harvard at age 18. And it's during those Harvard years from like 1906 to 1910 that he completely breaks away from that strong Unitarian influence.
Just drops it.
Well, he doesn't just rebel, he becomes entirely indifferent to the church. It just stops mattering to him.
And this vacuum, this loss of his family's faith, is where his literary awakening rushes in. In 1908, he reads Arthur Symon's book, The Symbolist Movement in Literature. And this introduces him to the French poet Jules Laforgue. And this is a massive turning point for him. What exactly does Eliot learn from Laforgue?
He learns this technique of confessing through voices.
Confessing through voices. Okay.
Yeah, instead of the poet just, writing a diary entry about their feelings, Laforgue taught Eliot how to dramatize irrational, chaotic thoughts by putting them into the mouths of distinct personas. It was a call for a new spiritual vision that completely eclipsed the old, rigid, realistic tradition of poetry.
So it gave him some distance.
Exactly. It allowed the poet to be both deeply personal and completely detached at the exact same time.
That is the seed of his entire poetic voice. So he starts publishing, but it's his physical environment that really catalyzes this new style. Because he leaves the peaceful, earnest phase of St. Louis and eventually finds himself in Boston. But this is not the old Boston of noble Puritan values that his family might have idealized.
No, not at all. The Boston Eliot experience is highly commercialized. It is packed with new immigrants, industrial noise, and in Eliot's eyes, it's just decadent and corrupt. He is so alienated from the academic elite that he actually deliberately moves into squalid slum areas.
Wait, really? He chose to live in the slums?
Yeah, he feels he's failing to find life, failing to find real meaning among his supposed equals in high society, so he goes looking for it in the dirt.
And that gritty, suffocating environment bleeds directly into his famous early works. Like when you read the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock or the Preludes, the imagery is entirely drawn from this disillusionment.
Yeah, it's all cigarette butts, broken glass, dirty windows.
Lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows.
Yeah.
It is the literal landscape of modern depression.
And he keeps running, trying to find an intellectual home. He goes to Paris in 1910, partly just to escape the pressure of his family constantly asking about his career path.
Typical post-grad move.
Right. And in Paris, he studies under the philosopher Henri Bergson, really grappling with concepts of time and consciousness. But by 1911, the novelty wears off. He finds Paris just as drab and spiritually empty as Boston. And this drab, mechanized, soulless modern city just becomes the permanent landscape of his mind.
And the journey gets even more chaotic from there. He goes back to Harvard, dives into philosophy, then crosses the Atlantic again to Oxford in 1914 to study Aristotle. He is so clearly looking for structure, for ethical forms. Then the First World War breaks out. The world literally tears itself apart.
Everything changes.
Everything. He meets Ezra Pound, who recognizes his genius. He falls in with the Bloomsbury Group. And crucially, in 1916, he meets and marries Vivienne Highwood.
Which introduces a profound, agonizing personal stress into his life. The marriage was deeply troubled, largely due to Vivienne's severe neurotic illnesses. Eliot is suddenly thrust into the role of a caretaker for a deeply unstable partner.
And he's working a day job too, right?
Yeah, all while working a grueling day job at the foreign department of Lloyd's Bank just to make ends meet.
So you have this pressure cooker, a failing marriage, a soul-crushing bank job, and the post-war disillusionment of an entire generation, all converging on this one guy. And out of that immense stress, he suffers a nervous breakdown, goes to recuperate, and drafts The Wasteland in 1921. He literally becomes the voice of a fractured world.
But he cannot live in the wasteland forever. He has to find a way out.
Which brings us to the monumental turning point of his life. The year is 1927. Eliot makes two massive life changes that absolutely shock the literary world. First, he becomes a British citizen. Second, he converts and officially joins the Anglican Church of England.
Yeah, the avant-garde poet of the slums, the voice of modern despair, suddenly pivots. In a famous 1928 preface, he declares himself a classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion.
That is a whiplash-inducing rebranding. I mean, why the Church of England? Why not return to the Unitarianism of his youth?
Well, because Unitarianism lacked the historical and theological weight he was craving. He was growing deeply attached to the English past, the continuity of tradition. But theologically, he was drawn to Anglicanism because of its specific balance.
Yeah.
It's an orthodox structure, yes, but it acknowledges that the ultimate truth of the scriptures is only dimly traced by humans and must be constantly verified by individual judgment and intellect.
So it didn't force him to stop thinking.
Exactly. At 39 years old, Eliot was desperate for a framework that offered spiritual discipline without demanding he turn off his massive intellect.
And this leads to him adopting a very specific type of faith. He becomes what is called an incarnational Christian. Now, for those of us who aren't theology majors, what does that actually mean in practice?
It centers on the belief that the coming of Christ into the physical world, the literal incarnation of the divine into human flesh, was the absolute most important event in the history of the universe.
Right.
It means the physical world and the spiritual world are not entirely separate. They intersected at a specific point in time. Because of this, sacramental worship, the rituals, the bread, the wine, the physical acts of faith are vital because they reaffirm that intersection of the divine and the material.
And he didn't just stumble into this specific theological niche all by himself. He was heavily influenced by a 17th century Anglican divine named Bishop Lancelot Andrewes. There's this great historical detail where Eliot meets an American diplomat who actually resigned from politics to become an ordained minister, and the two of them just bond over 17th century theology.
Yeah, Eliot found his intellectual hero in Bishop Andrewes. What fascinated Eliot was that Andrewes possessed what he called a medieval temper.
What does a medieval temper mean in this context? Because usually we think of medieval as, backwards or barbaric.
Right, but for Eliot, it means the ability to completely unite thought and feeling. Eliot famously critiqued later poets like John Donne for having a dissociation of sensibility, meaning their intellect and their emotions were at war with each other.
Oh, I see.
Donne was always combating a strong, chaotic, emotional personality with his intellect. But Andrewes had the discipline to become entirely one with his subject. He balanced intense religious devotion with razor-sharp intellectual analysis. For Eliot, this balance of emotion and intellect becomes the ultimate gold standard for his own writing.
So his poetry shifts. He moves away from the fragmented despair of the wasteland and writes deeply religious, searching poems like Ash Wednesday and The Journey of the Magi. But he also realizes that poetry on a page might not be enough. He starts experimenting with drama.
He wants to put these spiritual battles on a literal stage.
And looking at his early theatrical works is vital because they are the raw blueprints for Murder in the Cathedral. The first major experiment is a piece called Sweeney Agonistes.
Yeah, published as fragments in 1926 and 1927, it is subtitled Fragments of an Aristophanic Melodrama, and it is a fascinating, genuinely jarring piece of work.
Jarring is putting it mildly. I mean, he is taking the classical Greek theme of the Furies, these ancient, vengeful spirits pursuing a guilty hero, and he sets it to the throbbing rhythms of a 1920s English pub and modern music hall vaudeville. I think the best way to visualize this for you listening is to imagine mashing up an ancient, bloody Greek tragedy with a sweaty, smoke-filled 1920s jazz club.
That analogy perfectly captures Eliot's intent, because why did he use jazz? Eliot felt that traditional theater had become too bourgeois, too polite.
Please safe.
Exactly. It had lost the communal energy it used to have in ancient Greece. He believed that the syncopated, driving rhythms of jazz touched the primitive, unrefined side of human nature. By using those rhythms, he could bypass the superficial, materialistic society of the 1920s and speak directly to the audience's primal fears.
And the plot of Sweeney is incredibly dark. You have two lower-middle-class prostitutes, Doris and Dusty, hosting a card party filled with anxiety and distrust. There's this mysterious caller named Pereira, whom they're terrified of, who represents a relentless spiritual pursuer they just cannot escape. Then Sweeney shows up, introduces a horrifying story about a man who murdered a girl and kept her body in a bath of acid.
Very grim.
Very. And the play ends with a thumping, terrifying chorus implying that Doris and Sweeney will both meet violent ends.
It's a brutal commentary on the modern world. Sweeney is a spiritual exile in an alien, soulless society. He is awake to the horror of existence while everyone else is just drinking and playing cards. It is Eliot's first real attempt at dramatizing a spiritual pilgrimage, the realization that the physical world is a nightmare and you must confront the spiritual reality. And crucially, this is where he introduces a chorus to voice the underlying communal dread of society.
Which brings him directly to his next experiment, a play called The Rock in 1934. Now, this was actually a pageant play written to raise funds to build new Anglican churches in the expanding suburbs of London.
Yes. Eliot was commissioned to write the words, specifically the choral passages, collaborating with a director named E. Martin Brown. Eliot didn't invent the plot, but this is the laboratory where he perfects his use of the chorus, which will become the heartbeat of Murder in the Cathedral.
The staging of The Rock is really striking. The chorus consisted of 7 men and 10 women, and they all wore half masks. Why the masks?
To emphasize their impersonality. They weren't playing individual characters named John or Mary. They were voicing the collective anxiety of humanity. Throughout the pageant, they lament how the temporal order money, politics, Physical comfort is completely taking over the spiritual order.
They even face challenges from a Marxist character, right?
Yeah, a character who argues that church funds should be spent on practical housing for the poor instead of church buildings. But ultimately, the chorus has to learn about the supreme power of the eternal over the temporal.
It's the exact thematic precursor to our main deep dive today. But before we finally step into the cathedral with Beckett, we must understand two major literary theories that Eliot brings with him. These are the tools he uses to build the play. The first comes from his incredibly famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent.
This is a cornerstone of modern literary criticism. For the longest time, the romantic idea of a great poet was, a solitary genius sitting on a mountain, creating something completely unique out of thin air, completely breaking with the past.
Like lightning striking.
Right. But Eliot says that is entirely wrong. He shatters that romantic illusion. Eliot argues that true originality is not about severing ties with the past. In fact, he argues that the best, most powerful parts of a poet's work are exactly where the influence of past traditions is most vigorously alive.
So individuality isn't creating something out of nothing.
No, it's the unique, contemporary way a writer absorbs the past tradition and reframes it for the modern moment. A new work of art does not destroy the tradition. It alters it slightly, forcing us to reevaluate the past while speaking to the present.
It makes perfect sense when you look at what he is doing in this play. He takes the ancient Greek chorus, the medieval morality play, the history of a 12th century saint, and he fuses them all together with modernist poetry and psychology. He isn't ignoring the past. He is weaponizing it for a 1935 audience.
Exactly. And the second vital theoretical framework comes from his essay, The Three Voices of Poetry. This dictates how the poetry in the play actually functions.
Let's explore these three voices. If I'm reading a poem, how do I know which voice I'm hearing?
Well, the first voice is the poet talking to himself or to nobody at all. It is entirely internal, meditative, and lyric. Think of a private diary entry written in verse.
Okay, got it. And the second?
The second voice is the poet intentionally addressing an audience, large or small. It's communicative, rhetorical, maybe even a bit preachy. It knows it is being listened to.
But it is still the poet's own thoughts and opinions, right?
Correct. But the third voice, and this is the critical one for drama, is the poet attempting to create a dramatic character speaking in verse. In this voice, the poet is not saying what he would say in his own person. He is completely restricted to saying only what he can say within the absolute limits of an imaginary character who is addressing another imaginary character within a specific fictional situation.
It is the ultimate test of depersonalization. The poet has to erase their own ego and completely inhabit the psychology of the character. So when we hear Thomas Becket speak in Murder in the Cathedral, we are hearing Eliot expertly wielding that third voice. We aren't just hearing Eliot's theology. We are hearing Beckett's agonizing struggle.
Precisely.
Okay. Armed with Eliot's biography, his incarnational faith, his theatrical experiments with jazz and masks, and his profound literary theories, the stage is finally set.
Let us open the doors to the cathedral.
The year is 1935. Eliot is commissioned by Bishop George Bell, who had been deeply impressed by the rock, to write a new play for the Canterbury Festival. And the setting for this premiere is electric. It isn't in a traditional West End theater. The play premieres in the Canterbury Chapter House, which is barely 50 yards from the exact stone floor where the real Archbishop Thomas Becket was hacked to death by broadswords in 1170.
You really cannot overstate how the physical environment dictated the art here. The chapter house had an imposing Gothic bleakness. Practically speaking, it only had one functional door for the actors to use, which meant Eliot had to carefully choreograph how characters entered and exited the stage just to build tension.
I read that the acoustics were terrible, too.
Oh, notoriously difficult. Eliot couldn't write fast, naturalistic dialogue. It would turn into an echoing blur in that stone room. He was forced to write a heavy, ponderous, deeply rhythmic verse style just so the syllables could be clearly enunciated and understood in that cavernous space.
But the physical space is only half the context. The temporal space, the historical moment of 1935, is equally heavy. The world is watching the relentless rise of fascism and totalitarianism in Europe. Tensions are building toward what will become the Second World War. Now, just to be absolutely clear to everyone listening, we are simply reporting the historical context here. We aren't taking any political stance on left-wing or right-wing ideologies, but the historical record shows that Eliot was deeply disturbed by the secular ideologies taking over Europe.
Yes, and years later, in 1959, he explicitly admitted that he wrote Murder in the Cathedral as a form of anti-Nazi propaganda. He wanted to fortify and defend the Christian worldview against the encroaching demands of the absolute secular state.
That immense political and existential tension is just baked into the very DNA of the opening scene. The play begins in early December 1170, and the very first voices we hear do not belong to kings or bishops. They belong to the chorus, which is composed of the poor women of Canterbury.
And these women are absolutely terrified. Thomas Becket is returning to England from a 7-year exile in France.
Just to give a tiny bit of historical backstory for you guys, Becket had once been the best friend and chancellor to King Henry II. They drank together, hunted together, ran the country together. But when Henry made Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury, hoping to control the church, Becket had a genuine religious awakening.
He chose loyalty to God and the Pope over loyalty to his friend the king.
Right. The friendship fractured, the politics got vicious, and Becket had to flee to France. Now, 7 years later, he is coming back, and these poor women are dreading it. They describe their current existence by saying they are living and partly living. What exactly does that mean?
It means they're existing on a purely temporal, linear timeline. They are surviving, but they are spiritually dormant. They go through the relentless cycle of the seasons. They gather apples in the autumn. They huddle by the fire in the winter. They watch the merchant make his money. They watch the laborer toil in the mud.
So they're just getting by.
Exactly. They have endured oppression, poverty, and occasional injustice. But mostly, they just want to be left alone. They want to do their mundane domestic chores in peace. They are partly living because they have absolutely no connection to the spiritual dimension. They are entirely disconnected from what Eliot calls the still point.
I have to push back on their reaction, though.
No.
From a logical standpoint, why would the poor fear the return of their archbishop? Historically, Becket was known as a champion of the poor. He washed the feet of beggars. He stood up to a tyrannical king. Shouldn't they be lining the streets with palm branches, cheering for his return? Why this creeping sense of doom?
Because they possess a deep, intuitive, almost primal sense that Becket's return is going to demand a terrible price from them. They sense that his arrival means sacrifice. In the Christian paradigm Eliot is exploring, true salvation is not a spectator sport. It requires participation, and it requires suffering. These women do not want a spiritual disruption. They are terrified of being drawn into the eternal pattern of fate. They know that if a truly holy figure, a Christ-like proxy, returns to a corrupt world, he will inevitably be sacrificed.
And worse, they know that they will be forced to bear witness to it.
Right, to feel the guilt of it and to have their comfortable, ignorant lives shattered by the reality of divine demand.
It is profound psychological resistance. It is as if they are please don't make us spiritually wake up because waking up hurts too much.
Yeah.
Let us just stay asleep and partly live.
It's a very human reaction.
It really is. While the women are panicking, we meet the three priests of the cathedral. They serve as a contrast. They are discussing the practical political situation, the rift between church and state, the endless negotiations with French king and the Pope. And during this discussion, the third priest introduces the defining central metaphor of the entire play, the concept of the wheel and the still point.
This is perhaps the most vital metaphor in all of Eliot's religious poetry. Imagine a massive turning wheel. The outer rim of that wheel is moving incredibly fast. That outer rim represents the temporal world. It is the world of politics, of daily chores, of anxiety, of linear time, moving relentlessly from past to future.
Like a really fast merry-go-round.
Yes. But at the very center of that wheel, the axle, is a point that is perfectly still. It does not move, yet it is the center around which all movement happens. That still point is God. It is the eternal, unchanging reality.
So if you are a human being clinging to the outer edge of the wheel, you're getting dizzy, you're getting thrown around by the chaos of history and politics.
Exactly. For the wheel to turn smoothly, for a human life to find peace, the moving parts on the edge must be connected to and entirely submissive to the still center. Humans must surrender their individual, ego-driven wills in order to move in harmony with God's will. The chorus of women and the three priests are currently caught on the spinning edge of the wheel. They are reacting to politics, to fear, to time. They do not understand the still point.
But then Thomas Becket steps onto the stage, and his very first word is peace. He immediately proves that he understands the still point better than anyone else in the room. He corrects the priest's anxiety. He tells them a profound paradox. He says, action is suffering, and suffering is action.
He is explaining the mechanics of the wheel. He knows that true spiritual power, true action, is actually found in complete passivity. By surrendering his own desires and submitting entirely to God's will, he achieves the ultimate form of action. He is no longer reacting to the king's politics. He is resting in the center.
However, just because Becket understands the theory of the still point doesn't mean he has achieved actual spiritual perfection. He is still a man, still in a physical body. Before he can become a true martyr, his will must be tested. The impurities of his ego have to be burned away. And this brings us to the famous temptation sequence in part 1.
If you are analyzing this play structure, this sequence is heavily indebted to the medieval morality plays. Specifically, a 15th century play called Everyman, where abstract concepts like beauty, strength, or greed are personified as literal characters walking onto the stage.
So, when these 4 tempters arrive to speak to Becket, are they actual physical men sneaking into the cathedral, or are they psychological projections?
Eliot deliberately leaves it ambiguous, but it is highly likely that they are internal figments of Beckett's own mind, exteriorized for the audience. This is Eliot utilizing his theory of the third voice and depersonalization. We are watching Beckett argue with his own soul, systematically stripping away his personal ego.
Let's examine these psychological battles. The first tempter steps out of the shadows. He is a courtier, a man of the world. He offers a return to the good old days. He calls Becket Gay Tom and reminds him of the pleasure, the laughter, and the deep friendship they used to share with the king before religion got in the way.
He basically says, look, spring is coming. Let's just go back to having fun in the meadows and forget this whole archbishop business.
It's like an old frat buddy trying to get you to blow off work.
It really is. But Becket dismisses this temptation quite easily. He essentially tells the first tempter that he is 20 years too late. In the life of one man, time does not go backward. The wheel only turns forward. The temptation of physical pleasure, of youth, and of nostalgia is no longer a serious threat to a man who has spent 7 years in austere exile.
I have to wonder, though, is it really that easy? He is human. Dismissing your fondest memories, the time when you were most loved and happy, doesn't happen without a pang of regret.
There is perhaps a flicker of regret, sure, but intellectually and spiritually, Becket knows it is an illusion. You cannot unknow the spiritual reality once you have seen it, so the first tempter leaves defeated.
Enter the second tempter. Now, this one is much more dangerous because he speaks to Becket's intellect. He offers secular political power.
He tells Becket to step down as archbishop and reclaim his old job as Chancellor of England.
Right. He argues that real power, the power to actually help people, is in this world, not the next. He says, think of what we could do. You could work with a king, dispense perfect justice, protect the poor, and do real, tangible good on earth.
This is a temptation of pragmatic compromise. It is the temptation of the statesman. The tempter makes a very compelling argument that, real power is purchased at the price of a certain submission. Compromise your rigid ideals, and you can govern effectively.
But Becket fiercely rejects this. He refuses to descend to what he calls a punier power. Why? Because as archbishop, he believes he holds the keys to heaven and hell. He wields eternal power. Why would he trade the eternal jurisdiction of God for the temporary, earthly politics of a mortal king? It would be a massive demotion.
Exactly. So the second tempter is banished.
Then comes the third tempter. This guy represents the rough, rebellious barons of England. He says to Becket, look, you are a Norman. I am a Norman. King Henry is from Anjou in France. He is a foreigner and a tyrant.
Yeah, let's form a political coalition, overthrow the king's jurisdiction, and give the power back to the country lords. We can use your moral authority to legitimize a revolution.
But Becket immediately sees the flaw. He refuses to betray the king. He says that if he cannot trust the king, who was once his closest friend, he certainly will not trust a pack of self-interested, treacherous barons.
And he uses a brilliant analogy here, comparing the idea to the biblical story of Samson in Gaza. Samson pulled down the pillars of the temple to crush his enemies, but he crushed himself in the process.
Right. Becket dismisses the third tempter, stating firmly, no one shall say that I betrayed a king. He will not use violence or political revolution to solve a spiritual crisis.
So far, Becket is 3 for 3. He is intellectually and morally fortified. He expected 3 visitors representing the classic Christian triad of temptations, the world, the flesh, and the devil. He thinks the test is over.
But then a fourth tempter steps out of the shadows. And this visitor is entirely unexpected.
The fourth tempter is the ultimate terrifying trap, because he doesn't tempt Becket with something Becket hates. He tempts Becket with his own deepest, most secret desire.
He tempts him with the glory of martyrdom. The fourth tempter essentially says, you are right to reject the king and the barons. Earthly power fades. Kings die and are forgotten. But saints, martyrs, they rule from the tomb forever.
It's incredibly insidious.
It is. He says, if you let them kill you, pilgrims will line up for centuries to pray at your golden shrine. You will have eternal glory, and better yet, your enemies will be eternally damned for killing you.
It is the temptation of spiritual pride. It is the ego disguising itself as holiness.
I always compare this to modern altruism, specifically on social media. Imagine someone doing a truly selfless, difficult, charitable act like giving away a massive portion of their income to a struggling family,
Sure.
or spending weeks building a house for the homeless. But they only do it so they can film it, post it online, and get millions of views so everyone in the comments will praise them as a modern-day saint. The physical act is good, but the internal desire for the glory completely poisons the good deed. It's entirely driven by ego.
That is an incredibly apt analogy. The action looks identical from the outside, but the internal motivation changes everything. If Becket dies just so he can be glorified as a martyr and rule from the tomb, his death is not a submission to God.
It's an ego trip.
Exactly. It is a supreme act of human arrogance. He is trying to force God's hand, and Becket is absolutely horrified by this realization. He cries out in agony, "Who are you, tempting with my own desires?"
He is genuinely trapped. He realizes his own mind is plotting his damnation. He says, "Is there no way in my soul's sickness does not lead to damnation and pride?" And here is where the play does something incredibly daring from a theatrical standpoint. After the fourth tempter speaks, Becket falls completely silent on stage.
The silence is the loudest moment in the play. The script notes indicate that while Becket stands frozen in silent agony, the chorus of women, the three tempters, and the three priests all begin to speak in an overlapping, alternating, almost liturgical chant. They create a terrifying whirlwind of anxiety and chaos around him.
Eliot is taking Becket's internal psychological battle and projecting it onto the rest of the cast.
Yeah, the tempters mock him, calling him a fool who is throwing his life away for nothing. The priests beg him to hide, to compromise, to save himself.
And the chorus of women expresses absolute cosmic despair. They claim that the sky is turning black, that God is abandoning them. They use all this terrifying, surreal animal imagery. They feel the breath of leopards, bears, apes, and hyenas.
It is a nightmare vision of a world without a spiritual center.
But through all of this noise, Becket stays silent. Why?
Well, the critic Helen Gardner provides a brilliant analysis of this silence. She points out that the last temptation's spiritual pride is so subtle, so deeply interior, that an audience cannot visually judge whether it has been overcome just by watching an actor.
That makes sense.
If Eliot simply gave Becket a speech saying, "I have now successfully humbled myself," it would sound incredibly arrogant and self-serving. The silence is necessary. It allows the audience to feel the crushing weight of his struggle without reducing it to a tidy monologue.
When Becket finally emerges from that profound silence, the whirlwind stops. He is completely calm. His will is resolved. And he delivers what is undoubtedly the most famous realization of the play, and perhaps one of the greatest couplets Eliot ever wrote. The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason.
He acknowledges the trap. He realizes that he must not desire anything for himself, not even the glory of being a martyr. He states, "I shall no longer act or suffer."
Which means
This means he has entirely surrendered his personal will to the divine pattern. He is no longer making choices based on his ego. He is simply allowing himself to be an instrument of the still point. He is ready.
Which brings us perfectly to the center of the play, a structural bridge known as the interlude. After all that agonizing, poetic internal struggle, Eliot shifts gears entirely. The poetry stops, the lights change, and we get a prose sermon delivered by Becket directly to the audience, set on Christmas morning in the year 1170.
The interlude is a brilliant pause. Becket has perfected his will, and he is now in a state of profound, unshakable peace. He addresses the congregation, which inherently includes the modern theater audience sitting in the dark, as dear children of God.
He preaches on the central paradox of the Catholic Mass on Christmas. It is the day you celebrate the joyous birth of Christ, the Savior entering the world. But according to Catholic theology, every single Mass is also a reenactment and celebration of Christ's brutal death and sacrifice. Becket asks the congregation, how can we possibly mourn and rejoice at the exact same time? To the secular world, this is madness.
But in the Christian mystery, it is the fundamental truth of existence. Joy and sorrow are inseparable.
He then pivots to the concept of peace. He reminds the congregation that on the night of Christ's birth, the angels promised peace on earth to men of good will. But Becket asks them to look out the window. Look at the world. Where is this promised peace?
Right, we have ceaseless wars, political strife, oppression, and violence. The barons are fighting the king is fighting the pope. Were the angels lying? Was the promise of peace a cheat?
It is the ultimate question of faith when faced with a brutal world. And what is Beckett's answer to his own question?
His answer is that the angels were not talking about temporal peace. They weren't promising political stability, a unified government, or an end to physical violence. Christ's peace is entirely different. It is spiritual calm. It is the peace of the still point. It is an eternal peace that exists within the soul, entirely regardless of the chaos and violence happening in the temporal world.
And he uses this definition of peace to explicitly define the true nature of martyrdom. This is the intellectual key to the rest of the play. He tells the audience that a Christian martyrdom is never an accident. It is not the unfortunate result of a political miscalculation. And crucially, tying back to his battle with the fourth tempter, he says a true martyrdom is never the will of a man wanting to become a saint.
Because if a man wills himself to be a saint, as we discussed, he is acting out of ego. He is trying to elevate himself. A true martyrdom is solely the design of God. God uses the martyr to awaken the conscience of the masses and lead men back to his ways.
The martyr is simply an empty vessel.
Yes, an instrument who has completely hollowed out his own desires to make room for God's will.
So this sermon officially proves to us, the audience, that Becket has successfully beaten the fourth tempter. He is no longer looking to rule from the tomb. He doesn't want the glory. He is just waiting for the design to unfold.
And this sermon perfectly encapsulates how Eliot and incarnational Christianity views history itself. Traditional secular history is purely linear. This political event happened, then that war happened, this king rose, this king fell. It is cause and effect.
But Eliot is presenting Christian history, which is a meta-story.
Exactly. It is the overarching story of salvation, where the eternal, timeless world intersects vertically with the temporal, finite world. In this view of history, a martyr's death isn't just a political assassination to be recorded in a textbook. It is a cosmic event ordained by God to heal the universe.
Wow. Okay, so Becket has made his peace. The sermon ends, but the temporal world does not care about his spiritual enlightenment. The real world demands blood, and that blood arrives just 4 days later. As we move into part 2 of the play, that beautiful spiritual calm of the interlude is violently shattered. The temporal world comes crashing through the cathedral doors.
It is December 29th, 1170. The chorus of women opens part 2. They are still fearful, but there is a subtle shift in their tone. They are beginning to sense that they must wait for God's purpose to unfold, even though they dread the pain it will bring.
To build the tension, the priests enter with banners, ritualistically marking the feast days that follow Christmas. St. Stephen the First Martyr, St. John the Apostle, and the Holy Innocents. This rhythmic marking of time creates a terrifying countdown.
Then the 4 knights arrive from France, and they do not come in quietly seeking an audience. The historical sources and Eliot's staging dictate that they act like wild beasts.
They are incredibly rude and aggressive to the priests.
Oh,
Right?
absolutely. They demand to see Becket immediately, and when offered dinner, they refuse, saying they want to roast their English pork first and dine on it after a clear threat that they intend to murder Becket before they eat.
When Becket finally comes out to face them, the knights launch into a barrage of frantic political accusations. They accuse him of treason, of stirring up trouble with the French king, and of illegally suspending the bishops who had crowned King Henry's son.
They also attack him on a class level. They accuse him of sheer ingratitude, reminding him that he was just a tradesman's son from Cheapside. He wasn't born noble, he was elevated to immense power purely by the king's favor, and now he is biting the hand that fed him.
It is a chaotic, screaming political argument. But Becket remains perfectly, infuriatingly calm. He politely and firmly refutes the charges. He says he is completely loyal to the king in all earthly matters, but there is a higher law he must submit to, the spiritual law of God and the Pope in Rome. He refuses to lift the excommunications, and he refuses to flee.
The knights realize they cannot bully him into submission, so they rush out of the room to get their heavy broadswords. The moment they leave, the priests go into a total panic. They try to physically drag Becket to safety. They want to pull him up to the altar, lock the heavy oak doors of the cathedral, and turn the church into a fortified bunker.
And from a purely human, temporal perspective, the priests are absolutely right. I mean, common sense dictates that if 4 heavily armed assassins are outside yelling about killing you, you lock the door. But Becket aggressively refuses. He demands they unbar the doors. Why? Why voluntarily let your murderers into your home?
Because Becket is no longer operating within linear time or earthly logic, fighting back with strategy, locking doors, resisting with physical force. These are all temporal responses. He tells the terrified priests, "It is not in time that my death shall be known. It is out of time that my decision is taken."
He is fully surrendered.
Yes, to the eternal design. He argues that the Church of God shall protect her own in her own way, not by fighting with beasts as men. To lock the door would be to rely on human engineering rather than divine will.
He forces them to open the doors. The knights rush back in, fully armed. They are mocking him, chanting in this deranged sing-song rhythm, acting completely unhinged. And then the assassination happens. The staging here is incredibly symbolic. The knights do not just attack him randomly, they intentionally form a circle around Becket to strike him down.
That circle is the ultimate visual representation of the wheel and the still point metaphor we discussed earlier. The violent, chaotic, temporal world represented by the knights spins furiously around the calm, eternal center, which is Becket, kneeling and surrendering his life to God.
As the broadswords fall and the murder happens, the chorus of women erupts in absolute horror. But the poetry Eliot gives them here is not just, oh no, a good man is dying. The imagery is profoundly visceral, almost hallucinatory.
They sing that they can smell the putrid flesh of lobsters and oysters out of season. They see rats, jackals, apes. They say the sky is heavy, the world is clouded in an oily filth.
They do not perceive this murder as merely a local political crime. They experience it on a metaphysical level. To them, it is a pollution of the natural order. It is a horrific, tearing rip in the cosmic fabric. Because a holy man, a representative of the still point, has been slaughtered by the temporal world, they feel that the entire universe is descending into madness and chaos.
It is an instant eternity of evil and wrong. It is intense, highly poetic trauma playing out on stage, overwhelming the senses of the audience.
But then Eliot pulls what I think is one of the most jarring, brilliant theatrical tricks of the entire 20th century. Just as the audience is drowning in this poetic horror, the reality shatters.
He breaks the fourth wall entirely.
Yes, the four knights literally step away from the bleeding, ruined body of the archbishop. They walk right up to the edge of the stage, look directly at the audience, and they drop the medieval poetry entirely. They start speaking in plain, crisp, modern prose.
Eliot noted that he borrowed this specific technique from George Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan. The purpose of this structural shock is to snap the audience out of their passive, emotional complacency. He forces the 1935 audience to suddenly look at these 12th century brutal murderers as if they were modern-day politicians standing at a press conference podium.
And they sound exactly like modern politicians. It is uncanny. They appeal directly to the audience's sense of reason and British fair play. The first night, Reginald Fitzurse steps up and says, "Look, I know you are all English. You believe in a fair trial by jury. You believe in hearing both sides of the story. Put your emotions aside and listen to our logic."
It is a chilling, masterful rationalization of pure evil. The knights argue that they acted completely disinterestedly. They claim they didn't kill Becket for any personal gain or out of malice. They did it solely for the good of the state.
The second night, Hugh de Morville argues that King Henry's goal was a unified central government with equal justice for all. He argues that Becket, by insisting on a separate set of laws for the church, was creating division and anarchy.
The knight essentially tells the audience, if you want a stable, modern country, you have to eliminate the obstacles.
It's pure political spin.
Yeah.
They're saying, look, we are not monsters. We just had to do the dirty, practical work to keep the country stable. You enjoy the stability we created, so you are welcome. But the rhetoric gets even more cynical. The fourth knight, Richard Brito, delivers the final, shocking verdict. He asks the audience to legally rule that Becket's death wasn't a murder at all.
Yes, because Becket intentionally forced the priests to open the doors, and because he actively refused to save himself or fight back, the knight claims that Becket brought his death upon himself. He asks the audience to return a verdict of suicide while of unsound mind.
It is the ultimate, cynical, secular interpretation of a spiritual event. The knights, trapped entirely in the temporal world, can only understand Becket's submission to God through the lens of madness and ego.
Exactly. They represent the cold, calculating forces of totalitarianism and state control that Eliot saw rapidly rising in Europe in the 1930s. The state cannot tolerate a higher moral authority, so it must eliminate it and then logically justify the elimination to the masses.
So the knights tell everyone to go home quietly, not to loiter in the streets, and they confidently exit the stage. But the play doesn't end on their cynical political note. It concludes with the chorus. The women come forward for one final speech, and we see a massive structural transformation in their collective character.
Throughout the play, this chorus has been on a profound journey. They started as terrified, passive observers who only wanted to partly live and hide from spiritual reality. During the murder, they recognized the cosmic evil and felt the horror of it.
But now, in their final speech, which takes the form of a Te Deum, a traditional hymn of praise, they take a monumental step forward. They become active participants in the moral universe. They say, we acknowledge our trespass, our weakness, our fault. We acknowledge that the sin of the world is upon our heads. They are explicitly accepting their share of the guilt.
They realize that their previous apathy, their desire to just look the other way and be left alone to do their chores, was itself a form of sin. It allowed the evil to happen. They finally understand the concept of the still point. They see the grand cosmic pattern, realizing that everything exists in God's light, and that the blood of the martyrs, while horrifying, is ultimately necessary to cleanse the world and renew the spiritual center. They have moved from paralyzing fear to transcendent glory.
It is an incredible character arc for a collective group. So we have thoroughly mapped out the plot, the characters, the theology, and the poetry. We understand the mechanisms of the play. Let's widen the lens and look at how this specific play sits within the wider literary universe. Because T.S. Eliot is certainly not the only writer who was fascinated by the story of Thomas Becket.
Indeed. For anyone rigorously studying this material, comparing Eliot's version with other adaptations is a foundational exercise. 3 other major playwrights tackled this exact same historical event, and their different approaches highlight exactly what makes Eliot's version so unique.
Let's run through them. First, we have the great Victorian poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, who wrote his play simply titled Becket in 1879. How does Tennyson handle the material?
Tennyson writes a very traditional 19th century historical drama. He focuses heavily on the political and personal conflict between King Henry and Becket. However, he introduces a rather soapy, distracting subplot involving King Henry's mistress, Rosamund, and the jealous, plotting Queen Eleanor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it muddles the central spiritual conflict with a lot of romantic melodrama. It is entertaining, but it lacks theological weight.
Fast forward to the mid-20th century. We have the French playwright Jean Anouilh, who wrote his version of Becket in 1959. This one actually became a very famous movie starring Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton.
Anouillh's approach is distinctly secular and heavily influenced by French existentialism. He focuses almost entirely on the deep, intimate, personal friendship between Henry and Becket and the devastating feeling of personal betrayal when they fall out. In Anouilh's version, when Becket discovers the honor of God, it is almost presented as an arbitrary existential choice he makes to give his life meaning. He isn't submitting to a pre-existing absolute divine order like Eliot presents. He is just choosing a cause to define himself against the king. It is a psychological bromance turned tragic.
And finally, we have Christopher Fry's play Kurtmantle,
Right.
written shortly after in 1961.
Fry takes a completely different angle. He actually centers the play more on King Henry himself rather than Becket. It explores Henry's desperate, almost noble desire to establish law, order, and a unified justice system amidst a chaotic, anarchic medieval world.
So it's from the king's perspective.
Right. In Fry's play, Henry's tragedy is that he builds a rational system of justice that ultimately demands the destruction of his closest friend. It is a play about the tragedy of statecraft.
But Eliot strips all of that away. He doesn't even put King Henry on the stage. He completely ignores the romance. He minimizes the political maneuvering, and he focuses entirely, obsessively, on the internal spiritual perfection of one man's will. Which leads us to the 4 different critical frameworks you can use to read and analyze Eliot's play.
First, you can evaluate it strictly as a poetic drama. This is Eliot proving his theory that verse is fundamentally superior to prose for expressing complex, ambiguous, borderline musical feelings on a stage, while still keeping the audience grounded in dramatic action.
Second, and most obviously, you can read it as a Christian play. It is a rigorous theological study in the perfection of the human will, and an exploration of the Christian view of history, where the timeless, eternal reality intersects with the messy, temporal world.
Third, and this is perhaps the most psychologically fascinating, you can read it as a biographical play.
Right, drawing the direct parallels between Becket's journey and Eliot's own life.
As the biographer Lyndall Gordon suggests, Eliot likely saw Becket as a model not so different from himself. Both were men of the world. Becket, a powerful chancellor, Eliot, a banker and avant-garde poet immersed in the gritty modern city. Both men moved from the center of secular society into deep spiritual danger and underwent a profound, life-altering conversion. Eliot was absolutely working out his own religious trials, his own battle against spiritual pride through the character of Becket.
And fourth, there is a feminist reading of the play. This critical lens focuses specifically on the all-female chorus. Some feminist readings argue that the chorus's overwhelming sense of guilt, their intense fear, and their ultimate submissiveness are negative products of a patriarchal structure.
The idea is that these women have internalized the patriarchal idea that they are small, powerless, and somehow to blame for the sins of the great men of the world.
It is a textually valid interpretation, but it is essential to balance it with a very practical piece of historical context regarding the gender of the chorus. Historically speaking, Eliot did not set out to write an all-female chorus specifically to make a grand statement about gender politics or patriarchy.
No, he didn't.
This is genuinely my favorite piece of trivia in this entire exploration. Eliot got his chorus from Elsie Fogarty's Central School of Speech and Drama in London. And because of the lingering, devastating demographic effects of World War I on male enrollment, the women at the school simply had much longer, more rigorous training.
Oh, wow.
Right. Eliot chose an all-female chorus because they were literally the most highly skilled, best voice-trained actors available in London, capable of handling his incredibly complex rhythmic poetry.
It is a perfect, humbling example of how practical theatrical constraints, like the acoustics of a stone room, the single door in the chapter house, or the demographic realities of a local drama school, can profoundly shape the creation and interpretation of a literary masterpiece.
It really is. Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's synthesize this journey. We started by exploring T.S. Eliot's own life, tracing his path from the optimistic Unitarianism of St. Louis through his rebellion into the squalid, gritty reality of Boston and Paris, surviving a deeply troubled marriage, and ultimately arriving at a profound intellectual conversion to Anglo-Catholicism in 1927.
We examine how he honed his dramatic voice, experimenting with jazz rhythms to touch the primitive soul in Sweeney agonists, and utilizing massed choruses in the rock. We saw how he developed his vital theory of the third voice of poetry, learning to completely depersonalize his writing, which all culminated in the creation of Murder in the Cathedral.
We stood in the cathedral with that terrified chorus of poor women who were desperately trying to partly live and avoid the crushing weight of spiritual reality. We watched Thomas Becket battle the personifications of his own mind, surviving the ultimate trap of the fourth tempter, the trap of spiritual pride, by realizing that doing the right deed for the wrong reason is the ultimate treason.
We unpacked his deeply paradoxical Christmas sermon, defining the true, eternal nature of peace and the selfless reality of martyrdom. We witnessed a horrifying cosmic murder by the Four Knights and analyzed their chilling, intensely modern political defense of totalitarianism.
And finally, we saw the chorus transform from passive, fearful victims into active participants, accepting their moral place in the universe. If you're engaging with this text on an academic level, or if you just wanted to understand why this play is considered a pillar of modern literature, you now have the history, the theology, the psychological mechanisms, and the literary analysis to fully appreciate it.
It is undeniably a play that demands a massive amount of intellectual and emotional effort from its audience. But as we have seen today, it rewards that effort with incredible, lasting depth.
It truly does. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. In Beckett's speech, right before the murder happens, as the priests are panicking, he tells them calmly that humankind cannot bear too much reality. In 1935, that unbearable reality was the looming, terrifying threat of world war, fascism, and the collapse of the moral order. But think about our world today.
It is a psychological insight that completely transcends the 12th century or the 1930s.
Exactly. In our modern age of endless distraction, algorithmic doom scrolling, and constant deafening information overload, we've constructed a million ingenious ways to look away from the deep existential truths of our own lives. We numb ourselves constantly. So ask yourself, are we, just like that early chorus of poor women in Canterbury, actively choosing to only partly live? Are we intentionally burying ourselves in the mundane noise of our screens and our daily chores? Because facing the true, profound reality of our existence, our mortality, our spiritual responsibilities, our ultimate purpose, is simply too much to bear. It is something to seriously mull over the next time you instinctively reach for your phone to avoid a quiet moment.
A deeply fitting and necessary question to leave them with.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel intellectually invigorated, more deeply informed, and thoroughly engaged. Keep questioning, keep reading, and we will see you on the next one.